All right, hello. Sorry, I was bouncing back real quick. So, welcome everybody. It's been a while since we've done one of these. I'm pretty excited. We got a guest on here. Who'll be sharing their experience, strength, and hope. Some people may know exactly who he is, and even more so for people that need to hear a message of hope and recovery, regardless of whatever circumstance you're going from. There is no stereotype of what addiction looks like. There is no stereotype of what recovery looks like neither, right? I think that it's important to get a well versed and multifaceted experience for anyone that's out there struggling, because some people have an experience of using that looks entirely different than the next. I think there is, like I said, there is no stereotype of what that looks like. Upbringings, life experiences, things that are going on. And we got someone on here. He's doing some really cool stuff. He's got a book coming out. He helped start a pretty popular band, I would say, and he's someone that now is doing some really cool things with his life, and his um, experience of everything he's been through has led him to this. And it sounds like, from what I understand, he's doing really good things to help both the mental health community and the addiction, alcohol, substance use disorder, whatever flavor you want to call it, don't care, world as a whole. So that's something that I think has got a lot of value, and I'm excited for him to share his story for everyone to get it, because I know some people need some good hope, and even more so, some people need to know that it is possible, regardless of where you are right now, to have a life that is different in a year from now. So without further ado, Mr. Ryan, if you would like to come and kind of share your experience, strength, and hope with the people tuning in, and as always, if you guys can share this out to anyone that may be struggling, they need to hear a message of hope that they can recover. It is essential. So if you're in recovery, if you love someone that's struggling and they need to hear this, if you could share this, let's get this out so that as many people possible can see this, more so, to me at least, so that the person that's struggling maybe sees this. And so, but yeah, Ryan, why don't you kind of share a little bit of your story, your ups, your downs, your lefts, your rights, and where you are now.
Well, thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to come on and talk about my recovery. It's something I love to do, to talk about recovery, because I'm a grateful recovering alcoholic, coming up on 7 years if I can make it a few more weeks. My life has changed in so many profound ways since I got clean. I couldn't have predicted all the ways in which my life has changed and improved for the better. It's kind of a long journey it's been for me, and maybe not in some ways the most typical story, but all of our stories are a little bit different, and it manifests in different ways, and recovery looks a little bit different for each person. I was kind of a late bloomer, so to speak, in terms of my drinking and using and all that. I was a kid that grew up with a really loving, supportive family, and everything looked really good from the outside in terms of my brother and I were high achieving kids. There was no addiction in our household, no abuse or neglect or some of the things that lead to real destructive patterns in terms of mental health. But there was this underlying issue of mental health in my family that you couldn't really see from the outside because it was a generational thing. There were traumas that went back to my parents' younger years that manifested in some ways in my life later on that I didn't really recognize as a young person. But as a teenager, for the first time, I think I felt like I was different than other people around me in the way that a lot of recovering addicts describe, just from an early age, feeling there was something different and there was some void that you needed to fill in some way. I felt that as a teenager, and it was the early 90s. It was the era of grunge rock and Kurt Cobain and Nirvana, Soundgarden, Pearl Jam. The whole Seattle grunge scene was my music. I related to it for that reason, because it was dark and it was introspective, and it really I felt understood in that music. And that really ignited my passion for music, which as a young person was really my first sort of spiritual connection, I think. I felt connected to the music that I loved. I felt connected to my friends who listened to the same kind of music. And then playing the drums, I felt connected to, expressing myself. And I felt a lot of freedom doing that. And I was not a kid as a teenager who was drinking or doing drugs at that point. But I was feeling anxiety and depression and things that I didn't really have words for or names for at that point, because we weren't really having a public discourse about mental health in those days. Me and my best friends, Adam Levine, Jesse Carmichael, and Mickey Madden, we worked for a decade taking that band that we started when I was 16 years old from my parents' garage all the way up to the biggest stages in the world. And it was, just an incredible journey from nothing to everything. You can imagine, from age 16 to age 28, it was my entire identity. It was everything that was my self-definition. It was my purpose in life. It was, as I said, my spiritual connection to the world and to everything that was important to me. And in my 20s, as we were kind of getting to that point where we started to have success, in the years leading up to that, was the first time that alcohol became something that wasn't yet a problem, but I can recognize now, looking back, that some of my thinking around it was alcoholic. The obsessive thoughts, the ways in which it was a way to try to facilitate and try to control the feelings I was having. And in those years, it was mostly just fun, wanting to go out and have fun with my friends and make it even more fun. It didn't look like it was a problem at that point. But when it became the band being on the road for about 4 years straight, a lot of the issues that I hadn't really addressed, the things that I didn't even recognize were issues until the external pressures kind of met up with the internal pressures, things that I had dealt with: perfectionism, sort of obsessive compulsive thoughts, imposter syndrome, feeling like I wasn't good enough and putting a lot of pressure on myself, never really being satisfied and always feeling like there was something, there was a disconnect and there was a void inside of me. When I was dealing with those feelings and the pressure was mounting, alcohol became something that was more of a self-medication at that point. It was a way to kind of deal with uncomfortable feelings or to check out for a night. And it wasn't to the point yet, even then, where it was a disaster yet. I was doing pretty well externally, but I started having problems physically and other ways that it was manifesting all this stress that was on me. As a drummer, I was having a hard time performing the way that I once did. And it got so bad that I eventually had to leave the band. I couldn't perform anymore as a drummer. My nervous system just kind of broke down. And that's when things really took a turn for me in terms of my use. Because whereas drinking had been something that was fun and to facilitate good times with my friends, or to just kind of check out and blow off some steam, now I was drinking to self-medicate. Now I was drinking to really just escape or avoid some really painful feelings, because I lost my whole identity at that point. Everything that had been my purpose and my sense of connection was now gone, and I was left with a both blessed situation in that I had money and I had access and I had freedom. I didn't have to have the kind of responsibilities that might keep you in check at that point in life, having to hold down a job and a 9-to-5 job and that kind of thing. But in some ways, that was a blessing and a curse, because I had all this time and all this freedom to rationalize and to enable my own addiction, and it really got out of check. But I went through all the phases of addiction, that we hear about, where I already talked about the honeymoon phase, and then as it was escalating, some of the negative things coming in. Once it got to a place where it was at a fever pitch, I then kind of went into the zone of what I call the illusion of control for a number of years there, thinking I had it under control if I just, I only drank on weekends, or I only drank at night, or I only drank beer and wine, instead of hard liquor. And as long as it looked okay from the outside, as long as I could show up to a family occasion and I didn't look like a mess and I could be coherent and then go home and drink more later, then I could rationalize and tell myself I don't have a problem, even though, the moments when I would sober up for those things were becoming fewer and further between, and the reality of my addiction was escalating over a number of years. And really in that time, my whole world was getting smaller and smaller. I was more isolated, more disconnected from life. Any sense of meaning or purpose that I had in life was becoming more and more elusive. And it became that alcohol really became my higher power. It was the thing, it was the answer to all of my problems. At that point, it was causing most of my problems too, but I still would look to it as a way to escape that feeling and to self-medicate. until it got to such a bad place where my mental health was just in a horrible state, physical and mental health, really. I was feeling physically sick. But mentally, I mean, what had been anxiety became full on panic disorder or even agoraphobia. Like I couldn't go out into the world without drinking or taking some kind of anti anxiety medication or both. And then there would be blackouts. And then there would be nights, that I was up all night drinking because I was trying to stay off the pills and just all the craziness, that the insanity of addiction that we talk about, back and forth between taking pills and drinking and thinking there was some chemical equation that was going to be the answer to all of this for me, and really just living in that state of denial and rationalization for a long time, until I really just got so sick and tired of living that way, and was truly humbled to the point that thankfully I was able to have a sort of moment of clarity where I realized that if I kept going the way I was going, it was just going to keep getting worse and worse until I died. Or I could start walking in the other direction, as terrifying as that sounded at the time, not knowing what that would be, what it would look like, what it would lead to, how hard it would be, just realizing I either need to decide now that I'm going to die and that I want to die, or that I want to live and that there are reasons for me to live, and that I, there's a reason for me to actually consider going through what seemed like a really painful and terrifying journey into recovery. And the first week that I was in rehab, I went to the Betty Ford Center, and I was in detox the first couple of days. I was shaking like a leaf and I was terrified. But within just a matter of days, maybe a week, that kind of started to change for me already, because I realized even a week in, when new guys were coming in behind me and I saw them shaking like a leaf and doing even worse than I was, that I had something to offer, that I could show these guys the things that I'd learned even in just a week of recovery. I could acclimate them to the process and tell them the things that I was starting to implement in my recovery. And that gave me the first sense of purpose that I've had in a long time, in being of service. And it also gave me that first sense of connection, spiritual connection to something larger than myself. That very isolated feeling of being within my own thoughts and feelings all the time was now being replaced by this connection to a community and to this purpose of service. So pretty early on in recovery, I got that bug, that new, more favorable addiction to something that was going to fill me up and give me some sense of contentment and serenity in my life. And so I just kept following that feeling wherever it would take me. And I was inpatient for a month. I lived in a sober house for a little while. And then I went to an IOP, an outpatient program, which was not 12-step based. It was a CBT based place, but I was doing the 12 steps at the same time. So I was kind of trying to just have a very holistic approach, mind, body, and spirit, anything that was going to be helpful to me and keep my mind centered in this feeling of connection and purpose and service, and just really embracing this feeling of contentment, serenity, and fulfillment in my life. And when I was done with that IOP, they asked me to stay on as a volunteer and talk to the newcomers and tell my story and offer some support in groups. And that was like the most fulfilling thing in my recovery at that point. So of course I wanted to keep doing that. And after doing that for 2 years, it seemed like I would be silly not to continue to do this in some kind of professional way. And I was getting a lot of positive feedback about my work there, which was giving me also some confidence and self-esteem, which had been knocked down so much in my years of addiction, that I thought, wow, this would be maybe a whole other level of purpose in my life. So that led me back to school after 20 years, since I got my undergrad degree, to go get a master's degree in clinical psychology and to become, at first I thought I would just become a drug counselor or some kind of counselor working at a recovery center. But then it became, I was just going to become a therapist. And that even broadened my horizons even more. So it was not just, working within a recovery world, but having this new passion for psychology and mental health and what that means abroad. And so I got really just this sense of direction in my life that I'd been lacking. I now had even passion. And so that was like really incredible, because I hadn't felt that since I'd been in the band, since I'd had that sense of of creativity and collaboration and real drive with the band. I now had that in a totally different way. That was something that was just my journey. Um, and so in the course of that, I realized the story that I've been living for a decade now had a happy ending. And I had this platform, having been in the band Maroon 5, to tell my story in a way that might help some people or inspire some hope and recovery. So while I was still in grad school, I started writing this book, Harder to Breathe, about my journey. And then that kind of opened up a whole other level of passion for me, because writing was something that I always loved. I've always been a creative person, and I had been neglecting that for so long because I'd been trapped in this world of my own anxieties and the perfectionism and all the ways in which my mental health was struggling. And now I was overcoming those things, and I had a voice, and I had things to say, and I had all these things I'd learned in my own journey. I had some wisdom to share. And so I didn't have a grand scheme for all of these things when I got sober. I was just putting one foot in front of the other and doing the next indicated action. But somehow in doing that, it led me to these places where I found new passion and new purpose. And I couldn't have foreseen it. But now, almost 7 years in, I'm a therapist. I have a book out. I'm a published author. I'm a writer. I've been writing a column for a magazine. I'm a mental health advocate, and using my platform to talk about mental health awareness. I have like 3 or 4 different hats on that were things I couldn't even imagine a decade ago that I'd be doing. And they're all very fulfilling. And it's not that I'm, I become a perfect person, or that I don't carry with me the demons that I had that drove my addiction, or the mental health challenges I've had in my life. I'm just a person in a process, one day at a time, trying to overcome the things that have challenged me, and finding it easier with each day that I stay on that path. And being really honest and vulnerable about the things that are challenging to me, and trying to share that as a way to connect with people that might see themselves in my struggles, and therefore see themselves in my recovery. So I'm very grateful to be almost 7 years sober. I'm very grateful to have a platform like this and to speak about this stuff. And it's what keeps me sober, and it's what keeps me motivated and feeling serene and content and fulfilled in my life. So thank you again for having me on.
There you go. Thanks, man. Everyone show some love for him coming on, getting vulnerable, And I like some of the stuff in your story, your experience, you're sharing about. I could definitely identify. And oh yeah, real quick, what's the name of the new book? I know it's on the thing. A memoir of making Maroon 5 losing. Because I know you said you wrote a book, and now you have another book coming out. Is that correct?
No, that's the book. That's the one book I have out. I
Memoir.
will. Harder to Breathe, a memoir of making Maroon 5 losing it all and finding recovery. It's out on Ben Bella Books. You can find it pretty much anywhere, Amazon or Barnes and Noble or wherever you buy books. It was a passion project for me, and like I said, writing was something I always loved as a little kid, even before music. And just the process of writing a full length book and doing it in a narrative style. It just gave me that creative outlet again, which was so meaningful for me. It really was therapy for me, as much as it was a mission, in terms of advocacy. It was having done all the work I'd done in my own therapy, and then in the 12 steps and all the other things I was working on in my recovery, writing my story in this way and crafting it after having told my story at NAA meetings and at the recovery center so many times. It was this ultimate sort of form of narrative therapy to really tell my story in a way that was going to be more helpful and productive for me, and hopefully for other people.
No, that's really cool. And then, but yeah, the certain part your in your story, I definitely could identify. Is well, like a lot of it sounds like some of your recovery looks like. I know I'm always a big advocate for finding what works. Like for me, I don't ever say publicly like what 12-step program, but I am a 12-step member. But I've also done therapy for like 6 years. Like I mean, my son's been in therapy, still goes. I've done couples therapy. I've done. I mean, I would say it's a therapy household. And it's just because for me it was like there's my experience was like, finding relief from the disease I found in a program, but finding relief from other areas in which I struggled in. I needed both. I needed therapy. I needed to do as much as possible. And I think that's what you were kind of saying, like trying to, as my good friend who passed away this past year would always say, take the best and leave the rest. And it was kind of like I wanted to find whatever avenue to give me as much as I needed to become whole, because like that's been my experience of recovery is an up and down roller coaster of returning to like feelings of whole and then crashing and then so on and so forth over and over and over again, because it's less recovery is like less about being more and it's more about just being exactly who I was designed to be, while dealing simultaneously with a way of thinking that is a negative. It's based on faulty belief systems and maladaptive coping skills, but above all, it's just that empty feeling inside. That something on the outside can fulfill it. Drugs, but shit, being in a band that got really big, like these are all things that can kind of fulfill that. I don't know that experience, but I do know all the other things as far as the being outside of a treatment center and really struggling to get my ass in the treatment center. I know those feelings of being low, and I think that's kind of like what I definitely could identify was like that empty feeling. Trying to sustain that empty feeling with substances or whatever it is that can give the illusion. I like you said, the illusion of control. It's a worded way that I've definitely said a lot. Where that's all it really addiction is just it's that attempt to control the uncontrollable, right? Like it's like the past has already happened, which created shame and guilt. Mostly shame. Guilt is passing. Shame is who I am, right? And so it's like now I am stuck in that shame cycle over and over and over again. And a lot of my using was like I was having this ongoing internal battle of trying to prove how much I'm not an addict, how much I'm not like my mom, how much I'm not like so and so by doing addict shit. Like that was the goal. I'm not an addict, so let me just do all these things that like by definition would say you might be an addict, Nick, And it was like that was the illusion, was that like by having this thought that like my goal is to prove I'm not, it's irrelevant as to how that all plays out. And then I feel the shame, and the shame was always the greatest deciding factor, right? Like it's like that feeling of shame was the predicator for what was going to happen next if I didn't deal with it, And it was always that I got high or I got loaded over. For me, it was like the experiences that I had in like my childhood. And therefore, at the end of the road, it was like, now I'm just getting high to cover up what I did yesterday, or what I didn't do yesterday that was expected of me, or like whatever the case was. And so the shame cycle became shorter but longer, in the sense of shorter, no more about longevity from childhood, but longer in the sense that it was like I couldn't stop it. I was unable to find a break or find that pressure valve release from this shame cycle or using. And it's like it's a never-ending cycle until one day you make that decision, or I made that decision, where it was like I still don't believe this, I definitely don't think it's true, but I'm gonna find out. Am I as bad as I tell myself I am? Am I as worthless as I tell myself I am I as minuscule and insignificant as I tell myself I am? And more so deciding as to whether or not it's worth it to try, and that's all it really comes. It's like those, I think that like the humility of right before someone stops using, it's like I don't know if I've ever experienced a level of humility quite like that. Like the moment before I stop getting high for the last time, that absolute understanding of what is really going on, that level of truth and humility is something that is hard pressed to find since and definitely before. But it's, I don't know if you experiencing like that absolute like what is reality, because I mean humility is simply put an honest relationship with the truth, an honest relationship with reality in perspective of how I fit into reality, because that's a lot of what it is. It's an inability to be honest with myself. It's an inability to accept things as they are, right? Those are all the things that lead to addiction by nature, or more so the catechism of the thought patterns behind it. And so therefore it's like right before I got clean, it's like, God, I'm this, I'm that. And more so it's like these behaviors I'm exhibiting or this and that, the pain I'm causing everyone. It's like I had that plethora of truth that was smacking me in the face. And then I had the most important thing, which was like getting help, which was actually following through with some action, you know? And I think that there's a lot of people that have that moment, that absolute level of truth. And I know I probably did too. I just don't remember it because I got high. I buried that thought, you know? And it was like that last time I didn't though. And it was that absolute moment of truth followed by action leads to the opening of the door, but the following through and walking actually through the door of recovery is the difference, right? And it's like that's when the shame is something that can be addressed. It's the thing that like if I'm no longer doing these things that in give me this impending feeling of the world is ending or crashing, right? Like the fear of getting clean, the fearing of ripping off the security blanket, the pseudo security blanket of thoughts and feelings, and facing life, right? Like learning how to grow up. I mean, learning how to actually become a human being, right? Because it's like I sold myself short for so many years. It's like when I finally decided I'm gonna find out what the hell's really going on. Like I'm gonna find out is everything in my head fact or is it all just fragmented, fractured bits and pieces of a personality? As you said, the imposter syndrome, like bits and pieces of things of other people that I've grabbed onto because somewhere along the lines I had no ability to actually start to stand up and start to build up like who I was in sense of character and sense of just like a dignity or whatever it is, like all the thing, integrity, like all those things that have great immense value. It's like I didn't even know how to stand up and figure out who am I? Like what am I? What is the truth? Like what is the possibilities of the truth? And it's like recovery is one of those things where it's like it gave me such an opportunity to actually start to find out. And you talked about having like multiple hats, and it's like I know that. Like I used to have one hat for a long time. It was the fuck up. It was the hat that you know what I mean? Like it was like any circle I was in, right? It was kind of like generally speaking. I mean, some people might have been a little bit worse off, but it's like most of the circles I was hanging in, it was like I was pretty high on the list, you know. And in certain circles, I was the only one that was. You know what I mean? It's just like to find myself have an opportunity to work with other people to actually find some sense of value in self and then do something like to help some other people to be able to grab the other person that's struggling and kind of show them the path. You know, you can't I mean, I can't make anyone do anything. I can't force recovery upon anybody. I can't promote even really like this is what you should do. Ideally, it's just kind of like the attraction rather than promotion of you see it and it becomes attractive. You want that, like, you know, and it's like I think that especially, you know, having some of the highs that you've experienced and then some of the lows from, you know, I guess like public persona that you had, I think that brings an immense amount of value too, because I think there is like a fundamental structure of what is the quote unquote what is an addict or what does an alcoholic kind of look like, you know, when in reality it's like most people think of an alcoholic and they think of the person that's homeless living under a bridge and like does that happen? Sure. The majority of people that struggle with alcohol aren't that, you know. Maybe they get there eventually, but maybe they never do. Maybe they would. So a lot of people actually get clean or they get sober or whatever before that ends up happening. And a lot of people are binge users, you know, and it's like one of those things where it's like there is no like stereotype. I know that um it's one of those things where it's like especially from the alcoholic world, it's like there's an immense amount of people that would consider themselves functional, right? Like it's like and I would assume there was a kind of, you didn't use that terminology, which I appreciate, but I know that's a terminology that like a lot of people say, well, I'm functional, right? And I know like my mom was like that. She would say, I'm a functional whatever, right? I'm not alcoholic, I'm functional. But like in interpersonally, it was like, no, it was chaos. It was a mess. You had a job. Like that was her functionality. It ended with clocking in and having a very nice job that she did and she did very well, and it was like but as soon as the doors kind of were closed and everything was at home, it was like there's a divorce, there's a DUI going, like all these like other little things, you know. It's like not showing up, it's all those other things. And I think that like I know that like my experience of my own personal experience, but then also like the lived in experience as a family member where it's kind of like I wasn't like that, you know. I didn't have the functionality of it all. I was like I got high until I didn't, and like there was no you know, it's cool. I think there's a level of the vast ability to have the many different types of the recovering alcoholic, addict, person, whatever, human being. I think that it brings such a great collective, because there's a lot of people out there that like can't relate to each thing. And I also appreciate you didn't go into like talking about specifics of substance. I know you said alcohol, but like if you did other things, you weren't like I did this and I did that. And I greatly appreciate that, because I think that like when people say like what is a drug of choice or substance of choice, it's a great way to cause division, right? Like, what is a way for me to find a way to disqualify myself from the process of recovery? And I like you talked about the feelings, and you talked about your insecurities and your inadequacies and your perfectionisms. And I think that like all those things that really matter, because it's like the feelings and the thoughts are the only thing. Like every single person that's like an addict or an alcoholic, there's one central thing that all of us can relate to, that has nothing to do with individual story, it has nothing to do with being like a me and whatever my story was and you and your experiences. It's the fact that there is something missing on the inside. And I feel like the medicine, which is alcohol, drugs, whatever, the medicine to make me feel less empty on the inside is the only way that I can ever not feel this way, is the only way I experience life, where I get that relief for a moment, and then it crashes and burns always. But it's like that's what all of us have in common, is that feeling like I'm not good enough. Sound like I always say, it was like when I was created, they kind of just fucked up and they forgot to put all the bits and pieces in. They just stopped. Like whatever God, whatever higher power, or just my parents, whatever, I don't really know. Not even gonna get into all that, but I'm just saying that like whatever it was, I always say like they just kind of stopped. They were like, wholeness, don't need that. Like sense of contentment, we're gonna leave that one out of there, you know. And it was like then recovery's like, well, regardless of all that, it's having an opportunity to take advantage of resources, to be willing to take an initiative into one's life and say I fucking matter. Like getting clean, getting sober, whatever, that was like when I said I matter. And I always tell people when they're on the phone with me and they're getting help, I say you matter. You don't have to believe me, because I know you don't, but you do. And if you stay long enough and give yourself a chance, you'll realize, oh wow, yeah, I do matter, you know. So I greatly appreciate it, man. And I think that like I think that like some of the stuff, I know you mentioned a lot about like CBT, and you mentioned a lot about like um kind of where it's now, where you're like a therapist and you've kind of done the gambit, you know. And I think that's like a relative commonality for a lot of people that get into recovery, is you kind of, I feel like you kind of go from that place of like sitting outside of a treatment center like, God, my life sucks, man. Like this is I don't think it can get much worse, or much worse than this. Maybe it can, but I'm not willing to find out, you know. And but yeah, man, I liked also so can you, if you don't mind divulging a little bit, what was the experience at like when you were at the high, like, you know, go down the valley of uncomfortability for a moment, when you were like here, man, and it was like, you know, your nervous system was kind of going out, like that was probably like, is there, are you comfortable sharing like that level of what was that transitional right there? Like I know you said experience in the using, so minus the using, but like that level of when you got clean, confronting some of those feelings. So less about when it was happening, but some of maybe the feelings of, I don't know, I'm not going to speculate your feelings, but some of the feelings you had to go through to stay clean and to kind of persevere through that.
Yeah, well, you talked, you know, about shame and how that can be the driving force, and but then it becomes self-perpetuating, right? You keep doing the thing that makes you feel more shameful, and then trying to medicate with something to escape the shame, and you just perpetuate that feeling of shame by making yourself more shameful. For me, it was, you know, I always had this level of insecurity or sense of inadequacy. Some of it was genuine, just in that being the drummer in a band that was a garage band was one thing, which we were. You know, we started in my parents' garage, but I never really learned to play the drums, you know, professionally. I never took lessons. I was self-taught, and that was fine as long as we were playing with other rock bands that were of that ilk. But when we got to the level that we were playing with pop artists that had, you know, professional bands behind them, people who had studied at the highest level, I felt a real sense of inadequacy and that imposter syndrome. And there was, I think, if I had one central thing that drove the psychology of it, it was this rumination on how I'm not going to be good enough and that I'm destined to fail. And just in the same way that when, like you're an athlete and you have to visualize the positive outcome, and the visualization of something positive can manifest that thing in the world. The opposite is true as well. If you fixate on how you're not going to be good enough, you're going to be a failure, there's something defective about you, which is the way that I felt, especially as things started to become more and more challenging. That can be a self-fulfilling prophecy too. You manifest that in the world because you keep telling yourself you're destined to fail. Eventually you're going to live up to that premonition, right? And so I don't know which thing contributed more. There were a lot of reasons why it came to that. But when it came true, when I had to leave the band and I essentially had failed in that way, that's when the intense feelings of shame came in for me, right? Because now I felt like all these insecurities, all of these senses of inadequacy, that there was something wrong with me, something defective, that there was some void inside of me, in my mind had been confirmed, right? And so that was essentially when I felt entirely shameful, and the drinking or using was a way to try to fill that void or to escape that feeling, or to pretend for an evening that I wasn't shameful and that I was, step into an alter ego as this, I'm just a party guy, I'm just a rock star, I'm just having fun. This is all just fun and none of it matters anyway, right? This real escapism. And so I adopted this real nihilistic approach to living. It was like nothing matters. And why bother trying? Why bother trying to be a better person or trying to live a more meaningful life? Because it's all just going to be disappointing anyway, because, I've already failed. The thing that was supposed to give me purpose and meaning is gone. And so I'm just doing the best I can to kind of get myself through what's destined to be a letdown of a life, right? The irony of all that, of course, was what you spoke on, which is that the thing that I was doing to self-medicate at a certain point was what was driving that feeling. It was no longer, it had been years since I'd had that loss and I dealt with the grief and the depression that came from that loss. At a certain point, it was more just the lifestyle that I was living that was making me feel isolated and insecure and anxious and disconnected. And so when I finally was able to get the substances out of the way, I was left with those insecurities, with how low my self-esteem had become. The confidence that I had in certain areas at certain points in my life had been shattered, first by dealing with that failure and how I had internalized it, but then with a decade of trying to escape that or not deal with those feelings, how it got to the point that it did. But I loved what you said about not giving yourself enough credit, because that's something that I talk about with my clients a lot, is like, give yourself a little bit more credit. We assume that we're going to fail. We assume that we can't adapt and get better if we just give ourselves the time and the grace to walk through difficult things. We're all adaptive creatures. As human beings, we're all capable of adapting to difficult things, challenging things. Some people have more challenges than others, but we're all capable of adapting to circumstances that are not ideal, and including our sense of shame, our insecurities, our inadequacies. If we walk through them, if we sit with them, if we process them, if we talk to a therapist about it, if we go to a meeting and commune with other people that are feeling the same way, we oftentimes don't give ourselves enough credit that we're capable of connecting and growing and learning, and then actually beginning to thrive at a certain point as we walk through those things. And that was what was true for me, is that all of a sudden, not only did I realize I had a lot more strength than I had been giving myself credit, I realized I had all these skills and talents that I had totally neglected and forgotten about because I was running away from myself for so long. I was like, oh yeah, I'm a pretty smart guy. Oh yeah, I can communicate pretty well. I can write. I can do. There's a lot of things that I can do other than be the drummer in Maroon 5 that actually give me a sense of purpose and connection and self-worth. And then you add to that, what is it essentially that gives you self-esteem in life? It's the ability to do esteemable acts, right? Yeah. So just showing up one day after another, just being kind to other human beings, being giving of myself, connecting to people, and sometimes just talking about my own insecurities, telling my story, or talking about my vulnerabilities. That was a way of being of service, because other people need to hear that, and they need to understand they're not alone. And that would give me more self-esteem. It's like, even when I'm talking about the things I'm most insecure about, even the things that have been most shameful for me, even that is a strength. Even that can be turned on its head and be turned into esteem. And so it just kind of fed on itself when I was doing that more and more, and I was able to really just reconnect with life in that way. That's when the shame started to dissipate, and it started to become replaced by these more positive feelings that came from growing and came from finding purpose and being of service.
But I think that too, yeah, like, something you just said, just it reminded me of something that I talk a lot about with people, where I say, like, using is like an attempt to negotiate with reality, right? So it's kind of getting clean is like why I mentioned like the humility aspect, and I think that of getting clean, of stopping using, really changing any habit that's like something that has a grip over oneself that you don't want to do, but you still do, right? That using against one's will. And I think that like the negotiations with reality have to stop. Like it's like, because then it's like, what am I negotiating? You know what I mean? Like my inability to accept like only the negative things that I keep self I keep causing, like they keep happening, right? Like I keep creating the environment where it's going to keep happening until inevitably I'm either dead or whatever, right? And so it's kind of like, what am I negotiating? Why is the truth so daunting? Because generally speaking, when it comes to using, it's like a lot of the pain that one's running, at least my experience was like, it's always like the past. Even yesterday's still the past, right? So it's like, even at the end when it was all about yesterday or last night, it was still the past. It was never like, oh, like, it was just, I always woke up in that feeling. So it's like recovery is just like realizing that like the hand's fixed. Like it's like I can't negotiate with reality if I'm only negotiating towards a negative light. Like I'm gonna negotiate from the truth, but all the truth is I'm worthless, I'm this, I'm that, like all these like negative narrative things that are going on. And then that could sidebar to another conversation of like internal dialogue is nothing but borrowed thoughts anyways. It's all borrowed, it's all been forced to me, it's all been given, right? It's like the proverb of especially like from Buddhism, where they talk a lot about like which I'm not going to get deep into that, but they talk a lot about that, like our thoughts are just borrowed, right? And that kind of also could be like Carl Jung would talk a lot about that, like which I know you're a therapist, so I love my Carl Jung, he's the guy. But he talks a lot about the shadow, and talks a lot about the experiences of the unconscious or the subconscious, and how it's all the collective of stuff like given, right? Like it's like my mom said this to me X amount of times, or my dad said this to me X amount of times, or I had this experience that was like traumatic, or whatever it is, right? Like where it's like these things are all given to me, and then it's like a lot of what mindfulness to me at least is like just realizing like, okay, like this is all shit. So I'm not even negotiating with reality, I'm negotiating with the thoughts that I have surrounding my perspective only about me in reality, and that's it, right? And it's like when I realize that, it's like, oh well, there's nothing to really, what am I running from? Like I can't change that anyways. I can look at these things and observe the thought, and then it loses the ability to have control over me. And a lot of like staying in recovery is simply that, where it's like having this constant stream of shit that can run through my head, and then deciding as to whether or not I'm going to take some action, whether it's therapy, meditation, meetings, steps, whatever it is, like whatever works for an individual. If I'm going to do these things that inevitably will help find some real relief from these thoughts. And then a lot of it's like feelings. Like I've heard people say, and I don't know if you had mentioned it, but I've definitely heard people say it a lot, where they're like, the worst thing about recovery is that you get your feelings and all that jazz. I think that's dumb. I don't agree with that at all. I don't think that the feelings are the problem. I think that like, and this has been my experience of learning, and definitely anyone I've ever worked with, which is just like we as addicts, especially, maybe all humans, but we consider our thoughts as feelings. They're not. They are different, right? Like the thoughts that I had for 6 hours straight on a loop is not a feeling. You know what I mean? Like it's like recovery gave me the ability to start to differentiate an obsessive thought and a feeling. Like I'm sad about whatever, right? And then if for 6 hours I've gone on this story And it's like, oh man, my feelings are killing. No, it's my thinking. My thoughts are the problem. My feelings were 7 seconds. This story I told for 14 fucking hours is not even my feelings anymore. I don't even remember what I felt at the beginning of it all, right? And it's like, so it's like, it's a beautiful thing to get feelings, even the painful ones. Dealing with the thinking, right? And that's a lot of what recovery is. That's different. Like the worst thing about recovery really is like getting my thinking, and the best thing is getting my thinking, like clarity and stuff like that. But feelings are great because it's like, even if they're painful, if I really sit with them, like even the loss I experienced recently, like a lot of things, when I sit with them, it's like it loses an immense amount of power over me. My thinking, on the other hand, they'll go sideways. And it's like, that's what I've had to learn, was like how to understand and allow myself to feel something. So therefore it doesn't lead to this 6 hour obsessive thought that I can't focus on the things in front of me, or if I am focused, it's halfway, and I'm barely even there fully, and I'm not even enjoying the ride. You know, it's kind of like Thich Nhat Hanh would talk about mindfulness in Western society and how you could practice it in driving. He talked about driving a car, where it's like, simply put, if you're driving and you have an hour-long destination, and most of us are going and we're focused on the GPS and the ETA, or if you're like me, I like to beat the ETA by 3 minutes. I'm always like, it's a game. It's like, how fast can I really beat it, right? But missing out on the ride, the trees as I'm passing, the beauty of everything that's happening around me, because it's always about where am I going. And I think that, like, for us as addicts, like that gets keyed up and turned up even more, where it's kind of like, all right, I really got to focus on this thing. And I think that's like you mentioned getting your, your master's. And so are you a therapist, a counselor, or on the social work side? Is it LCSW or LCPC or LMF?
LMFT.
Yeah. So, okay. So either way, like the ride of getting there, right? Like the process, the pain, the experience of it, which I know you mentioned a little bit of, like sharing, at the very end there, you mentioned about sharing your pain and your insecurities and how that's beneficial. And I believe this, because I always tell people, it's, you can't share the message without sharing the mess. Like I have to, and I don't mean the using. I think the message thing, a lot of people talk about like the drug logs. No, I'm talking about like the pain of experience, like whether it's custody battles that I've been through, whether it's like whatever it is, like since I've been clean, those painful experiences, sharing those things, even though they don't look pretty, because other people will have that experience, and it's like your ride of getting your master's, and that's awesome. That's like a huge accomplishment, right? And then being able to turn around and then do what you do for a profession now. And I think that, like, that ride up, which is, from my understanding of getting a master's, it's more like a fucking like this than a ride up. It's more like, ah, And so it's like, it's one of those things where it's like, that's beautiful, man. I think that, like, and I appreciate it, because I think that when we have people that can articulate the message of recovery in a way, it's beneficial. And I think that you have an ability to articulate the message of recovery in a way where it is eloquent. I will use that word, in a way where it's kind of like it has a great ability to reach people. And I think that, which circles back to the beginning of what I said, where it's like there is no like stigmatizing, or no, there is no stereotyping of like what someone that struggles with alcoholism or addiction is, because it's a gambit of different things. And I think that, like, the fact that you do carry your message in a way where it's attractive, in the sense that, like, you know what you're talking about, but you do it in a very eloquent way. And I appreciate that, because I think that I'll be honest, some of the stuff I see and that represent us as alcoholics, addicts, or whatever, I'm just like, come on. You know what I mean? Like, I was just like, let's carry it in a way where we look good. Like, we don't want to, be already add to the already existing stigma of what it is to be an alcoholic or an addict, where it's kind of like the things along the lines where people may say we're this or we're that. And I know they wrote an article once about us, and they said I looked like the stereotype of a drug addict, because I had like tattoos and all these things, long hair tattoos, and they mentioned some other stuff like vaping or something. And I was just like, man, that's crazy, because it's like there is none, and that newspaper article got ripped apart because people were like, my dad's this and he didn't have this. It's like, but it's like anything that kind of can take the time to get to know people and really get to know people. And I appreciated you coming on and having that vulnerability of sharing your experience. And I think that I would definitely be interested to do more things with you in the future, because I think that I'm excited. I want to see your book get promoted. I'm one of those people that's like, let's share the love. Like if you're someone that I think that like there's a lot of division that happens automatically, especially in like the treatment world. Like there's tons, everything's like a snake pit. I feel like, and I think that like in reality, it's like, man, coming from like the humble beginnings of like trash, like nothing, like you could fit everything into a pot that I had, and it's like, coming from that and having an ability to grow, but then to help other people grow. I appreciate like the fact that you do that level of service and being a therapist and taking that into the next level, because I think that like that's super beneficial. I think that my experience with working with good therapists, like the one I've had for years, is a phenomenal experience. I think that like it's one of those things where people that do struggle, you have an endless ability to find out really what is the truth. And I think that the truth is always subject to revision, but when I was getting high, it was always subject to the same, if not worse. And I think that like being in recovery, it's subject to revision truly, because my beliefs of last year, even though I was clean and blah blah blah, are way different about certain subjects and certain experiences than they are today, right? And I think that's like being open-minded to the realities of what is the truth, and being open to like not being guarded or jaded about like, okay, I had this one experience that worked for X amount of time, and if it no longer works, having to detour and have that not be such a bank of, I think you mentioned earlier about like having your identity tied into a band. And I think that's like, as an addict, that's an identity. Like that's when I got clean. My identity was tied into being the black sheep, being the fuck up. I mean, I wanted to carry myself in a way where I sounded dumb, like I sounded very uneducated, because I wanted the expectation of me to be so low. And then it was like when I got clean, it's like, man, I'm not really dumb. I've been pretending and imposter. I've been doing like the opposite. I was like, how do I feel sound? I want you to expect so little, and then it's like you get high, and then like everyone just kind of expects you to do crazy stuff at most, and at least nothing, and it's like raising the bar for expectation of oneself. I think that's a lot of recovery, is like having an expectation of no longer settling for nothing, no longer settling for, I'm going to give myself the bare minimum, which means everyone else gets the bare minimum at best, because that's all I'm worth, and removing away from those thoughts of I'm worth nothing, because there was never like a feeling. It was always a thought, I'm worth nothing, because if it was a feeling, I would have had validity to back it up, and I didn't have validity until I got high. Before that, I didn't really have validity. I just had borrowed experiences from trauma and other things where it's like these things happened to me. Like as a child, I didn't do anything. Like being molested, like all that stuff, I didn't do that. That happened to me. I was a victim. I think there's a level of getting into recovery where it's like moving from victim mentality, but also part of healing is to take a dip back into times when I was an actual victim, to heal from that, right? So therefore, I can remove myself from the shame cycle of the victim mentality that I experienced as an adult. It was only, in many regards, because that undealt with stuff as a child, I carried it all this time, and then as an adult, since I never healed from it, it just looked like I was being a woe is me, sappy ass as an adult, when in reality, I was just stuck in this mindset, and I became guarded in defense mechanisms that were around these things, so I'll never experience this again, or I'll never go through this experience. I won't allow myself to become vulnerable enough or intimate enough with other people that this or anything along this lines, I could ever experience these feelings ever again. And it's that level of guardedness that created the self-fulfilling prophecy of unhappiness, discontent, the feelings of worthlessness, the thoughts and feelings of I'm not good enough, something is missing, right? And it was like by healing these aspects of the childhood and as an adult, the things that I did maybe when I was getting high, or at certain points in my life that I felt great immense amount of shame. I had to go into that area. I had to get real uncomfortable for a moment in order to feel better, in order to find some real true relief, some relief that, would actually, I would feel and I would carry with me, and then I could share that with the next person, rather than it's something that is pseudo and made up of either substances or sex or like whatever, anything that isn't actually authentic, in the sense that like I have this experience and it's beautiful and I'll have it forever with me. and I'll be able to share this with myself, with other people forever. And above all, I know that means that I can have it again. I know that means that when I am going through my recovery and things are hard and everything seems to be falling on me, and woe is me is kicking in, and maybe life is kicking my ass, because I've definitely had a little bit of that. An experience that I had, that I know at one point or another I will have it again. And recovery gave me that sense of, like, the storm can happen, but I can find peace, and I don't have to make the storm worse. And using as the storm's happening, so let me make the storm bigger and bigger and bigger, and then look around the room and say, why is everyone pissing on me? Like, why is everyone, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah, well, from a trauma-informed perspective, a lot of times we use substances to deal with something that's too difficult to deal with for us. It's so painful that we don't want to go there. We don't want to process those feelings because they're so painful and shameful. And the irony, though, is that we're beyond just escaping them or avoiding them. What we're actually doing is we're piling on more trauma, right? We're re-traumatizing ourselves, because essentially what we're doing is we're treating ourselves the way that we had been treated before. We're treating ourselves as if we don't matter. We're treating ourselves with we're treating ourselves without love. And the answer to any kind of trauma is to find self-love, right? To treat ourselves with kindness and compassion, to realize that we do matter, as you said, that we all matter, and that the things that were done to us, or the terrible things that happened in our life, we didn't deserve them. What we deserve is love and kindness and compassion, most of all from ourselves, right? Yeah. And so when we self-medicate, what we're doing is the opposite of that. We're saying, your pain doesn't matter. Let's not deal with it, and let's just throw on all this other crap on top of it. It's uncomfortable to strip that all away, but it is an act of love. It's an act of self-love to strip that all away and to walk through those feelings and to treat yourself with a little bit of compassion.
For sure. And I will be mindful of the time. I know it's about an hour, so I know you're a busy man, and I do appreciate you coming on, my friend. And once again, the book, if anyone hasn't gotten a copy or looked at it, where's it located at again? Where can they find the book?
Yeah, you can find the book on Amazon or anywhere really you buy books, barnesandnoble.com.
Go. Anywhere you can find books, Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, get the book. What was the first part? It said, okay, Harder to Breathe, a memoir of making Maroon 5, losing it all,
and finding recovery.
Go ahead. Sorry.
It's kind of my whole journey from the early, parts of my mental health issues that I didn't really recognize through the years of the band, which there's a lot of fun in there too. It's not all dark stuff. There's a lot of inspiration and fun and creativity and some great stories about, our time on the way up, our time at the top, the relationships within the band, because the relationships are a big part of our psyche, right? And then it deals with the pain, the loss, and the heartbreak, and the ways in which it became addiction and alcoholism for me. But then ultimately, the end of the book is it's a happy ending. It's about recovery, and it's about the things that I've learned about my journey, and about being a sober person, and finding, going from suffering to thriving.
That's awesome, man. I appreciate you coming on. Everyone show some love again. And if you didn't get a chance, share this out, because this is a hell of a message. And like I said, there's this book, and if you didn't get a chance to check it out, feel free to check it out. And if you got anything you want to say on your as we bid adieu, for someone that's out there struggling right now.
Yeah, well, I guess I just reiterate, you are worth it. You matter, and treating yourself with self-love, with compassion for yourself, is just the first step, but it's so important. It's that moment of recognizing. Think about that, to be in a place where you're feeling so shameful and so beaten down, and really lacking any sense of self-esteem, self-worth. What an act of courage and of self-love it is to say, I'm done with this. I deserve better than this. And no matter what happened in the past, no matter, whether the things that make me feel intense shame, the things that have been painful, I deserve better than this. And I'm going to start treating myself as if I do deserve better than this.
Yeah. Well, thanks again, my friend. And other than that, I like to say this, and we'll wrap it up with this. I appreciate you coming on, my friend, and for anyone that's out there right now, I hope you find some peace today. If it's 5 minutes, 5 seconds, 5 milliseconds, because I know there's been many days of my life where I couldn't even pray for a second of peace. So hopefully you find a moment, and if you have it, I hope you realize it and really allow yourself to experience that. I'll see you guys soon, and I love you guys. Thanks again.